We're talking to Walter Williams today, the great Walter Williams. Walter Williams, you all know, he's the John M. Olin Distinguished Professor of Economics at George Mason University and a nationally syndicated columnist. He also fills in for Rush Limbaugh on Rush Limbaugh's radio program. Professor Williams has written 10 books, among them The State Against Blacks, Up from the Projects, an autobiography, and most recently, Race and Economics, How Much Can Be Blamed on Discrimination. And I'm so pleased to be able to welcome to the program Walter Williams. Walter Williams, thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you.
I want to start off with a recent column of yours in which you were talking about the idea of peaceful secession, which sounds so crazy and radical to most people, and yet you explain it as if it's just common sense. So can you just tell us, what was the point of that article? What were you driving at there?
Well, the name of the article is Parting Company. And I asked the question, if one group of people prefers a strong government control, management of people's lives, while another group prefers liberty and people desire to be alone, should they be required to enter into conflict with one another to have their way? Should liberty-loving people be forced to enter into conflict with those people who want government control? And I say, no, they should not be forced into conflict. That is, they should part company. And I was given the example, the problem that we faced as a nation is very similar to a problem in a marriage. And that is, one partner in the marriage disobeys the marital vows, tries to impose all kinds of restrictions on the other partner. And the question is, should they be forced to fight? Or should they peaceably separate? And I think that they should peaceably separate. Now, when people bring up the issue of the war between the states in 1861, and they point out, well, do we want all this bloodshed? And I say, no, we don't want the bloodshed. We want people to be able to peaceably separate from one another.
When you explain something like this, it sounds so logical. It doesn't sound like you're saying anything crazy. But yet, for some reason, Americans seem to be almost allergic to the idea of secession. They're okay with secession if it's going on somewhere else in the world. The Czechs and the Slovaks can secede from one another. But for some reason, it's unthinkable for the Union to be divided into smaller parts. Why do you think that is?
I don't know, but I think that most Americans do not have a very good understanding of our history. When we seceded from King George, the Treaty of Paris was written in 1783, and the Treaty of Paris established 13 sovereign nations. New York was a nation. Pennsylvania was a nation. And so these nations came together in 1787 to have a confederacy. If you read the ratification documents of New York, Rhode Island, and Virginia, they say that if the federal government becomes abusive of the powers that we've delegated to it, we have the right to resume those powers. And matter of fact, the Constitution of the United States would have never been ratified if the states did not believe that they had the right to secede. One other thing, we have to keep in mind, the average American just does not know that the federal government was created by the states. That is, the states are the principals, and the federal government is the agent of the states. And principals have the right to fire an agent.
Well, I couldn't have said it better myself. That's the point, is who were the principals and who is the agent. And on that topic, of course, I can't help bringing up the subject of state nullification. You were kind enough to write a nice blurb on the back cover of my book on that subject, and then you testified in front of either the House or Senate Judiciary Committee, I think, in South Carolina.
It was the House.
It was the House. Okay, on the subject of nullification, and we were all cheering you for that. And this has become a bit of a controversy. There are people who increasingly support this idea, but then you find some people in right-wing radio, I don't want to mention names, who are quite abusive toward people who believe in the idea of state nullification. Can we put you officially on the record as being in the pro-nullifier camp?
Well, I take the position of Jefferson and Madison when they wrote the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions.
Yeah.
And they said if Congress makes laws that are unconstitutional, we have the right to ignore those laws. We have the right to nullify those laws. And moreover, Madison said that we should not give the Supreme Court a monopoly on the interpretation of the Constitution. Because if we give the Supreme Court a monopoly on the interpretation of the Constitution, then we'll be living under oligarchy.
Turns out they weren't just making that up. As a matter of fact, we now know exactly what their dystopia that they feared would be like.